Welcome back, folks, to part 5 on our unit on natural selection. Today we're going to be talking about AP Topic 7.6, the evidence for evolution. Okay, so this stuff goes along with section 22.3 in your book, covers this general stuff. So evolution is supported by a lot of evidence. Four main types of data that document the pattern of evolution. A lot of these we've already talked about. We just need to highlight them as evidence opposed to when we were talking about how evolution works. So we have direct observation, homology, the fossil record, and biogeography, which we haven't talked about yet, but we will. Okay, so direct observations, that's a lot of the stuff we've talked about already, like antibiotic resistance, how bacteria have developed resistance to antibiotics over time, so we can see that evolution in our lifetimes. The beak size on Galapagos finches, DDT resistance in those mosquitoes, and we've talked about a few others. Okay, just a point to make: natural selection does not create new traits, but it can edit and select for traits already present in the population. So the traits have to be there, and then natural selection can select who lives and who reproduces or not. Okay, and the current local environment determines which traits will be selected for or against. Right, so it's up to that environment at that time determines which traits are selected for. So we can see all that stuff in the day to day. We can see it actually happening in front of us. Another bit of evidence is homology. We've talked about homologous structures. We've talked about divergent evolution and common ancestors. So I don't think I need to repeat too much on that. Homologous structures are anatomical resemblances that represent variations on a structural theme present in a common ancestor. So you see all these things have a common ancestor that had four limbs. It was a tetrapod. And the first limb was a long bone. And we had two long bones, a bunch of little bones, and then a bunch of digits on the end. All of these have that. The likelihood that all of these different organisms would have independently from an ancestor didn't have those bones developed these structures that had one bone, two bones, little bones, long bones, unlikely. What's much more likely, and what evidence supports and what evolutionary theory supports, is that there was a common ancestor that had this basic structure, and then over time evolution worked on, and natural selection worked on that basic structure, and depending on the environment the ancestors were in, tweaked it a little bit, right? A little bit longer bone or a little bit wider bone or a little bit different angle on the joint may have given them some advantage in the environment, and eventually wind up with a grasping hand, a running foot, a flipper, and a wing. Pretty cool. Comparative embryology is also dealing with homologies, but ones that aren't visible in the adult. For example, you can see all of these vertebrates here have a tail, okay, early on in embryological development. Now, the farther you get, the more, it changes to look more like what they are today. But you can see early on, they all look very similar. And they all got these little pharyngeal arches, sometimes called gill slits up here as well. So that's more evidence that they came from a common ancestor and then diverged. Vestigial structures we talked about in Bio 1. I don't think we've talked about it in this unit yet. So they are remnants of features that served important functions in the organism's ancestors. A prime example in humans would be the appendix, right? You only probably know about the appendix because it gets infected and people have to have it removed. The appendix doesn't really do anything for us anymore. There's some evidence it might have some slight lymph system function, but it's minor. In the past, it probably helped us with digestion when our diets were different before we started cooking and eating a lot of meat and stuff. But since that's not the case, we don't need it for our digestion anymore. It has gotten smaller and smaller. There'd be no reason for it to be there unless it used to have a function in our ancestors. It just hasn't been gotten rid of yet. It isn't good for our survival, right? Which is why it's way smaller than it used to be, because it is being selected against, but very slowly. It's just a slight disadvantage. Most people's appendix don't cause them problems until, if they ever do, until after they've had kids later in life. Sometimes it's earlier, sometimes it's later, so it's not a super strong thing. Goosebumps, that's left over from when we had thicker fur, right? You've seen animals in the cold, they puff up, right? Birds puff up, dogs puff up, and what's happening is the fur is getting stood up on end, and that traps an extra layer of air in the fur, kind of like a puffy jacket, right? So we have little muscles in our skin called erector pili muscles. that are what's doing that. Now that makes a lot of difference if you got feathers and fur that's thick enough to trap air. We don't. Okay, and I've got more than the average person, but that's still not enough to trap any air. Yet we still have erector pili muscles, and we still get goosebumps when we get cold because there's no real selective pressure against it, or the selective pressure is extremely minor against getting rid of that trait. So it's still around. It's a vestige of our past. Wisdom teeth is another example. Um, Rear leg bones in whales is an example. Okay. We also can trace homologies in the molecular data, like we talked about in an earlier one. So I'm not going to go through there anymore. We talked about phylogenetic trees. So this tree thinking can be a way to highlight evolutionary connections and ancestries. Um, like feathers evolved here, and that common ancestor to all birds. The amnion evolved here, and then everything that descended from that has an amnion. What would be the chances that species that weren't related at all, didn't have a common ancestor with an amnion, would both develop an amnion independently? It's a relatively complex way to give birth. So it seems unlikely, right? So it's much more likely that it is evolution and common ancestry. Convergent evolution we talked about, where they become more similar because they're in similar environments. So often we think of evolution as causing things to become more different over time and creating new species because they're in slightly different environments, so they become more different if they're separated and don't have gene flow. But evolution should also predict that if you are in similar environmental conditions with similar selective pressures, it would make sense that you would evolve similar morphologies and similar strategies for surviving and reproducing. Okay, they won't be based off the same underlying tissues necessarily, like with the shark and the dolphin we talked about, but they will get you to the same basic point. So you look really close, even though you're not related at all. Like the flying squirrel and the sugar glider, that's a marsupial. They both evolved from four-legged tree-dwelling creatures, and then developed the flight. Okay. And then, of course, you got the fossil record, which we're going to get even more into. But it provides a lot of evidence. We can see that there are species that have gone extinct in the past that aren't here anymore. We can also see when new species pop up in the fossil record that weren't visible earlier on in the fossil record. And if we got good data in a certain group of animals over a long period of time, we can actually see that change over time, like we saw in our jackalope experiments. For example, here we can see an ankle bone in a dog and what most mammals look like. We got two bumps up here and one down here. But in pigs and deer, or even toed ungulates, we got two bumps on top and two bumps on the bottom. Whales, we can see the same kind of thing. So that tells us that whales are more closely related to these guys than they are to these guys. And we can track their fossil record over time and see how they've changed. They're probably one of their closest living relatives today is pigs and hippos. And we can see they have a common ancestor here. Okay, and then we had a split, and these ones eventually became modern day whales. A lot of them have gone extinct. We can see their line ends, and this is a phylogenetic tree that's got years on the bottom, so we can interpret that as they've gone extinct. But we can see how they've changed slightly over time until they are now well adapted to living in the water. Biogeography, many of you probably know the continents do move, called continental drift. And you can see kind of a reenactment going on here with how the continents have drifted over the past 200-something million years. Way back when, all of them were connected in something called Pangea, but they've started to drift apart, 200 million years ago or so, until we get to our current present day. So interesting things you can do with that. We can actually find fossils here in Africa and here in South America of this creature, and we can't find them anywhere else. So what is most likely accounting for that is the fact that when this was all Pangea, this was their range, and we can figure out where Africa and South America connected. Okay. The chances of that creature evolving independently on both continents is insanely small. And you can see that for other things here as well. A little video here, catch you on the other side.
By studying various fossil records, geologists have put together a geologic record. Evidence in the fossil record of large-scale extinctions and/or enormous radiation of many diverse new life forms defines the main boundaries within the geologic record. As you move through the geologic record, the names and dates will change. Also, a diagram at the upper left will show what is known of the history of continental drift, based on evidence dating from the Mesozoic era. During the Precambrian time, which began at least 4,600 million years ago and ended 542 million years ago, life began on Earth. The first prokaryotic cells and cyanobacteria appeared, as well as the first animals. The beginning of the Paleozoic era, 542 million years ago, marked the origin of most modern animal phyla. The first plants, jawless fish, bony fish, and amphibians evolved. Amphibians became the dominant vertebrate life form, while the first reptiles and seed plants appeared. By the end of the era, 251 million years ago, many marine and terrestrial organisms had become extinct. The Mesozoic era stretched from 251 million to 65 million years ago. At the beginning of this era, the reptiles radiated out as dinosaurs to dominate the landscape, along with the cone-bearing plants, or gymnosperms. At the same time, the first birds and mammals originated. As the climate and Earth's surface changed, flowering plants appeared and many organisms, including most dinosaurs, became extinct.
The Cenozoic era followed the Mesozoic, 65 million years ago, and continues through modern times. The beginning of the era saw the radiation of the mammals, birds, and pollinating insects such as bees and butterflies. The angiosperms evolved to dominate the landscape as most modern mammalian orders appeared. The primate groups evolved, leading to the origin of ape-like human ancestors, and finally humans.
All right, guys, if you're doing this on your own, now's a good time to go and do concept check 23.3, number 1 and 2 on page 479. If you're in class, we'll discuss it in class. So just a quick lesson in fossils and how we date them and how they're formed. Nothing too detailed here, guys, but with the fossil record, like we've talked about before, it reveals the changes in the history of life on Earth. We can see how organisms, what were there in the past, what are here now, when some developed, when they went extinct, how they changed over time. And fossils, you can see here in this diagram, you got a creature, it dies. If it's covered up quickly enough before everything decays and gets eaten and dragged away, it can get covered up, buried in sediment underneath water or a mudslide or something. And then over time, more and more layers form over the top of it, compress down, and we turn them into fossils. Then through weathering, sometimes they get exposed or we dig down and we happen to find them. Okay? So that's where we find most fossils. You do have to keep in mind, though, few individuals have actually been fossilized, and even fewer have been discovered. So, of all the creatures that have ever lived, how many of them actually died in an area where they're going to get covered up quickly enough and completely enough that they could even begin to fossilize, and then stay under long enough that they become fossilized, and then don't get destroyed by other geological processes like erosion and earthquakes and things like that, and then move to an area where humans can find them, and then via uplift and things like that or erosion, and then humans find them and recognize them before they get destroyed. I mean, the chances of that happening are minuscule for any individual organism. So the fact that we have as many fossils as we do, frankly, is quite amazing. But what that does do is it does skew the fossil evidence a bit to certain types of organisms. Ones that have lived for a long period of time, there's a lot more of them, a lot better chance we're going to find them in some layer or another. Ones that were abundant and widespread, that were all over the place, more likely they're going to be in an area that we can get to. And it had hard parts that would fossilize well. Soft stuff just doesn't fossilize. So we see things that have shells and bones. We don't see a lot of fossilized evidence of, say, jellyfish, for instance. How do we date these fossils? Well, as you dig down through the strata, the lower layers were formed earlier and these ones were formed more recently. So the deeper you go, you're getting older. So relatively older as we dig down. We know these ones are older than these ones. Okay. That's essentially it. But how do we get to determine the exact age of the bones, like their actual age, not just relative age? This one's older than this one because it was buried deeper. Then we can do radiometric dating. You may or may not be familiar with radioactive isotopes. Um, they can decay into daughter isotopes at a fairly constant rate. We know that is half life, and that's the time required for half of a parent isotope to decay. So carbon 14, okay, can decay down to normal carbon 12, and it takes about 5,700 years, something like that, for carbon. So we can see that here. So fraction of a parent isotope remaining. So when you're alive, you are taking in all the carbon in the atmosphere around you, right? Carbon 12 and carbon 14, which is at a fairly fixed rate. Carbon 14 is stable, carbon 12 is stable, carbon 14 is unstable. So up here, you should, if you just died, you should be able to, see X percent of your carbon is carbon 12 and Y percent is carbon 14. As you're sitting in the ground, the carbon 14 is going to decay and turn into other things. So we can measure the relative amounts of carbon 12 to carbon 14. The more carbon 14 you have, the more recent you died. The less you have, the longer ago you died. And we can use that to kind of figure out how many years ago you died. And that works up to about 75,000 years. Beyond that, then we got to go back to the strata, right? And we can, up here, we can maybe do radiocarbon dating on these dudes. Down here, we're using relative dates, and we're dating the age of the rocks that formed around them, right? So if this is a rock layer that we can radioisotope date with like uranium and it was a volcanic explosion or something like that, to 500 million years ago, and we can date this to 590 million years ago, we know this layer formed somewhere between 500 and 590 million years ago, so it gets us a closer date, and that's how we do it. All right. At this point, guys, I think we're going to be done with the evidence stuff. I'd like you to do the topic questions on AP Classroom on 7.6, and I'll see you in class.